Hi, this is Nancy Yearout, and welcome to my show, High Road to Humanity. In every episode, I tell you powerful true stories filled with great wisdom that you can use in your own life as you strive for a higher road to travel. My featured guests will have their own unique stories to tell that enlighten your mind and your soul. So kick back, relax, and learn the secret to success when you take the high road.
First touch, strong connection, it lays deep in your soul.
Hi, it's Nancy Yearout, and welcome to High Road to Humanity. And today, Dr. Laurie Nadel is here, and she's going to be talking about the 5 gifts. And I'm really excited to have her on the show today. Her book is The 5 Gifts, Discovering Hope, Healing, and Strength When Disaster Strikes. And if you're watching me on YouTube today, I'm holding her book up, and I'm sure you can pick this up on Amazon. But before I bring Laurie on, let's talk about what's happening with humanity. You know, it's difficult to watch the news these days, but even though this show's recorded, we're going to talk about humanity. And I pulled this up. It says Biden lays out the COVID strategy, the first full day in office. And this comes from Washington. It says President Joe Biden laid out his plan to combat the coronavirus pandemic on his first full day in office, warning Americans that the worst is still to come. Wow. Let me be clear, Mr. Biden said during the event at the White House, things are going to continue to get worse before they get better. The president signed 10 executive orders to vastly expand testing and vaccine availability with the goal of administering 100 million vaccines by the end of April. He invoked the Defense Production Act to compel federal agencies and manufacturers to increase key supplies needed to fight the virus and implemented new travel restrictions meant to curb its spread. Lori, I haven't brought you on yet, but what do you think about all this? You're pretty involved in the COVID thing, huh?
Yeah, I lead 2 support groups for long haul COVID patients. One is with firefighters with the long COVID, and the other is for anyone who's been sick with COVID past the immediate acute phase. That one is open to anyone, and you can find out about it and register at pulmonarywellness.org. It's a not-for-profit foundation, and all our services are free. What we're finding, there are several layers to this pandemic. I was calling it a triple strand pandemic. Firstly, it's what we call a disaster of uncertainty, because unlike other events, say 9/11 or a natural disaster, it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And it can take a long time to recover psychologically from the specific event. There are many, permutations.
Do you agree with what Biden says, that it's going to get worse before it gets better?
Absolutely.
Really? You think that too?
Absolutely. Well,
Why do you think that?
Because there's a new strain of virus which is 50 to 70% more contagious, and it's killing more people. And you have a strong anti-vax movement in this country, and people who walk around without masks and who don't believe that there are any kind of hygiene measures that can keep themselves and other people safe. They go into high contagion situations, as we've seen in many of the protests, demonstrations. You see people partying, and then more and more people get sick because this is a more highly contagious virus. It's going to afflict many, many more people.
That's crazy. Well, thank you for sharing that. I always like to bring out some good news. So, Lori, we're going to talk about some good news now.
Well, I think, I'm sorry. I think it's good news if people pay attention.
It is good news if people pay attention. But the bad news on that one is that there is another strain, and it is more contagious. So that's the part that really freaks me out. And yes, you're correct. People do need to social distance and wear the mask and do what they need to do to make sure that we can get this thing under control. So I agree with you wholeheartedly.
Exactly.
Yeah. My good news is that there are salmon spawning for the first time in 80 years in the upper Columbia River. Hey, so tribal biologists have confirmed that Chinook and Steelhead salmon are spawning in the upper Columbia River system in Washington state for the first time in 80 years. The discovery of 36 reds, along a prime 8-mile spawning stretch of a tributary of the Columbia called the Sandpool River confirmed the Colville tribe's suspicions. So this is really cool. It was a shock at first, they say. Then they were overcome with complete joy, and they were so excited to see them come back. So this hasn't happened since, gosh, the dams were built in the 1930s. So hey, we got a little bit of good news out there for us today. So anyway, I'm excited to have Dr. Laura here today. Laurie Nadel is here. She's a journalist for for 20 years. She's a specialist in acute stress, trauma, and anxiety issues. She is considered a thought leader in the emerging field of acute stress and PTSD. So from trauma to addictions through workshops, lectures, and one-on-one sessions, her focus is helping people find new ways to heal. Welcome to High Road to Humanity.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me as your guest.
I'm excited you're here today. Your book was really interesting, but tell us your story. I mean, because you were a journalist, and then you saw a lot of people going through disasters. I mean, what prompted you to write this?
Well, there are a lot of events that happened in my own life, but mainly I spent 20 years as a journalist, as a field reporter, and working in newsrooms the last 10 years in CBS News. And I became aware after watching sometimes dozens of disasters a day coming in on satellite feeds from all over the world, that people whose lives were shattered by sudden violent events would need some kind of special care and attention in order to recover. And what happened was I burned out covering the Iran-Contra hearings back in the 80s, and I developed a chronic fatigue syndrome, an Epstein-Barr kind of virus. And because there was no way to treat it with conventional medicine, I started learning about meditation and Chinese medicine, and I was able to recover in about half the time as most people recover from that illness. And decided at that point that I would go back to school. And I earned 2 doctorates, one in cognitive psychology and one in clinical hypnotherapy, and opened a practice in 1991, helping people recover from traumatic events, which was at that point it was a very new field, and there weren't a lot of people looking into that. So it's been my privilege over the last 30 years to work with teenagers whose fathers were killed in the World Trade Center attack, to do work with first responders and teachers after the Parkland shootings, and in my own community after I lost my own home to a hurricane, to help people in my community recover psychologically from the trauma of losing their homes.
Mm-hmm. That's really crazy. You went into this work and then it happened to you. We've got about 6 minutes or so before we go to commercial. Tell us what happened to you personally.
My house was destroyed in 20 minutes. I had 4 feet of water, 3.5 feet of water come in to my little beach cottage on a barrier island outside of New York City on Long Island. And everything that I built as a single mom was wiped out. My washing machine was floating.
Oh my God.
That's the force of the water that was coming in. The couch, I had a big heavy couch that was floating. It was bobbing up and down. It was like the movie Titanic in my house.
Wow.
And then when the water receded, we learned that the sewage pump for the town had broken during the storm surge. And so everything, the soil, all my potted plants that I'd brought in to rescue, my library, any artifacts that I'd collected from spiritual healers during my travel, everything was destroyed.
Oh, wow.
And, I was, when I tweet or I say to people who are preparing for a hurricane, be prepared, because one of the hardest moments of your life will be when you walk in and see the damage after the storm has passed.
I wonder if it changed you to the point where you started to realize, because I've gotten like this in the last, probably year I moved, and I have all this stuff. And I started to realize that the stuff wasn't important. I could get more stuff. I mean, I know you said you had artifacts, and I'm like that too. I mean, I collect rocks. I'm a rock collector. Everybody's got their thing. But I don't know. You start to realize that maybe you can start to travel a little lighter, and maybe the stuff is not as important. Did you get to that point, with all this happening? to
Well, I
you?
was kind of relieved, actually.
Okay, that's funny.
I mean, I just kind of looked at it and I said, well, this is, I'd been studying Buddhism and meditating since the 1980s. And I said, well, here's a teaching on impermanence. I mean,
Mhm.
everything that you thought that you had built that was, solid,
Right.
of the structure, and all the things that you invested, that had meaning, purpose and meaning that you had collected, that I had collected over the years, which it was just gone. And I felt a kind of relief
Mhm.
because now I wouldn't have to decide what to do with it, or was I going to pack it when I moved, or was I going to store it? I mean, it was just that the decision was kind of made for me.
Mhm.
And I felt also that, one of the messages, I guess, that I received from a spirit during the storm was that I could carry the feeling of my home in my heart, and
Ah,
that I didn't physically need to have this particular home. I had actually become overly attached to that house,
that's
and
true.
I
Yeah.
never,
Yeah.
never liked to leave it. I mean, it was the most comfortable place for me in the entire universe, and I'd actually become kind of socially phobic. I didn't like to go anywhere, and I remembered that when I was in my 20s, when I owned very little, I kind of lived like a gypsy, and there was a
Mhm.
journalist. I traveled around, and I carried, just about everything I owned in a little suitcase and a shoulder bag. And I remembered, I know how to be a gypsy, and I guess I have to step back into that and enjoy the sense of everything being new again. And
Right.
so, kind of, it opened me up for that sense of discovery, and being more prepared to expect the unexpected.
Yeah. When you're talking about this, I was looking at my notes because in your book, you had talked to Dr. Wayne Dyer, and, and you interviewed him. And then there's a quote that says, when you're sitting at your table, so to speak, and you feel so comfortable, that's when God rips off the tablecloth. And as you're speaking, that's what that reminded me of, that quote, because that's what happened to you. You were too comfortable. So God ripped off the tablecloth and he said,
Right.
no.
That's right. And God said,
Yeah.
you're not meant to be here anymore,
Yeah.
and we'll find something else for you to do, someplace else for you to go. But
Huh.
and I really felt that, that rupture with the connection that I had to the house, so that even when I had it rebuilt so that I could sell it, the soul of the house was gone after that night, and I knew that I would never go back there.
That's
So
crazy.
I also didn't want to live with the threat of another water event happening
Right.
down the road, because it was very close to the water. And that had always been my dream, to live near the water. And
Mhm.
sometimes it's a beautiful thing, and sometimes it can be kind of terrifying. So both are
Yeah.
true.
Yeah. How funny. Wow. Hey, listen, you guys, I'm here today with Laurie Nadel. We're getting ready to go to commercial break. Her book is called The Five Gifts, and we're going to talk about those five gifts on the show. So share this show. Let your friends know about it because, we've all been through a lot of trauma, and this will be very helpful. Okay. So this is Nancy Yearout. This is High Road to Humanity, and we will be right back. Hi, it's Nancy Yearout. This is High Road to Humanity. I'm back here with Laurie Nadel. She's a PhD. She's got a fabulous book out. Hey, Dan Rather wrote your foreword. How cool is that?
Amazing.
I mean, talk
Amazing.
about
Dan.
that for a minute. Do you mind? I just think it's
No, of
awesome.
course. Yeah, of course. Yeah. Dan has been my writing mentor for many years.
Oh, wow.
I don't know. I don't know why. He just keeps encouraging me to keep writing, and he kind of pushed me to get this book out. So I'm very
Nice.
grateful to him.
Nice. Well, and I think you're helping a lot of people because you go through the book and you talk about different things that are really important. You tell your story and then you talk about in trauma, there are different things that you have to go through, after the aftermath. You even talk about the Las Vegas shooting. You interview a lot of people. Out of all the different people that you interviewed, I mean, what was some of the most compelling stories? Would you mind telling the audience some of the stories of the interviews you did?
Well, thank you for asking. There is a chapter, chapter 3, which is about first responders, because I think that really one of the purposes of the book was to look at how different cultures explore or recover from, any kind of disaster, war, living under dictatorship, any kind of situation where our rights or our survival needs are threatened. And I got to interview some absolutely amazing people, including a friend of mine who had been an ambulance driver for UNICEF in Rwanda during the genocide. And he spoke about having to lead rituals for forgiveness on national television so that the killers could come in and receive justice, but also to be reintegrated into Rwandan society.
Wow.
So I think that it's really, a profound importance that we begin to look at countries that have been severely divided through politics, through class wars, through racial, from apartheid or racial war, genocide, and that we learn from these models of reconciliation that they've had in South Africa and Rwanda. We need to look at other cultures, like indigenous cultures, that have humility and patience when it comes with dealing with natural disasters, because they believe it has to do with that our relationship with Mother Earth is out of balance, and that when we learn to listen to nature, we can be more respectful.
Yeah.
And I think that that's also a very beautiful message. So I've been very privileged to study with spiritual healers in a number of different countries. And what's interesting is that they all say the same thing, no matter what language they speak, no matter what conditions they're living in, whether it's a hut in the jungle or whether it's a house, outside of a major capital city. And they all say that all of nature speaks, and that, they kept saying, you in the North, you people in the North, or the industrialized world, you've forgotten how to listen. And
Right.
so nature is angry,
Right.
and nature is going to keep getting louder and louder. They call the Mother Earth, they call her Pachamama, and they call the mother of the sea, they call her Yemanja, and they say, that the mothers are angry, and they will speak more and more loudly, as the climate change issues, or as the environmental issues become more severe. One way to look at that is that our spiritual relationship with the forces of nature is really dissolved over the years
Right.
because
Right.
we stop listening.
Right. It's really funny you would be talking about this, because last week I had a gentleman on from Mexico, and he's a healer, and he taught us on the show how to connect with Mother Earth. And he talked about the statues that you see, and how there's always one foot in front of the other, and there's always a fist up. And that was like a signal for us to connect with Mother Earth. And you're exactly right. I mean, you are right on, Lori, because we have totally lost our connection. And I think there are people who are connecting. That's why I do the show, like you, like me. I mean, there are people out there talking about this stuff. There are people who are raising their consciousness. But you're correct. I mean, we have totally lost, like people are like, why is this going on? I mean, seriously, don't you think after a while, the earth is alive, don't you think after a while, it's gonna react. And that's what's happening here. And I think the more that we become aware and conscious, then things will start to change. What do you think?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think it's important that we have a environmental consciousness movement that's global, that's growing. You talk about good news, and at the beginning of a new administration, rejoining the Paris Climate Accord is huge. Um, I think it's just really important that each of us pay attention to our own individual relationship with our surroundings, with the natural environment, and that we spend time, with each of these five gifts that we can talk about. There is each gift corresponds to an element in nature, and I
Okay.
recommend that that we spend time with that element, even if it's just looking at a glass of water or looking at a flower, where you can connect to the earth by meditating on the flower or the glass of water, or light a candle, or just do something very simple that will build that heart connection to nature. Because many of us live in cities where we don't have huge expanses of earth.
Mhm.
We don't have a lot of parks. We may not have access to water, a lake or an ocean, but we can bring those elements into our home environment,
Mhm.
and they will help us to honor that sacred connection that people have had for thousands of years
Yeah.
in many, many different cultures throughout history.
I'm glad you're talking about this because everybody that comes on my show, I mean, the majority, I've got a lot of spiritual people, and they all talk about connecting to the divine. And that's great. But you're the second person in the last couple of weeks, so we must be needing to getting the message out here to connect to Mother Earth because, and it's interesting because Mother Earth is what provides us with our water and our food and all of these things, and we don't even think of it that way. We don't even think of giving back to what the earth is giving us. So it's quite interesting to hear you say these things, and I agree wholeheartedly. You talk about the five gifts, and I want to kind of get started on those. The first one you talk about is humility. Be humble. I can remember some guy I was dating when I was much younger, and I just thought I was hot stuff. And he looked at me and he says, you need to humble yourself. And you know what? I never forgot it because sometimes we all get out there and we get full of ourselves, and that's something that's really happened in our society. So the quote that I wrote down here says, we become humble when the world shakes us to our roots and we begin to examine what's important in our life. What do you think, Laurie?
I think it's absolutely true. And I think, again, we talk about these disasters, which are humbling, if nothing else,
Mhm.
because we realize that there are things in life that happen to us that are not within our control. We cannot prevent them. We cannot cure them. We just have to come to terms with sometimes unspeakable events that happen, and that takes time. And the gift of humility, and the gift of humility basically helps us. It gives us the grace to accept things that we cannot change. And most of the time, these are things that were not our fault. I mean, we didn't create them with visualization or negative thinking. God isn't punishing us. This is just part of the cycle of life. And
Mhm.
when when I speak to people from many, many different countries around the world, most other countries, parents will give their children a different mindset about life in general, and that in any given lifespan, we have cycles of hardship and cycles of abundance and cycles of illness and cycles of health and cycles of war and cycles of peace. And, if you live long enough, you're going to experience a number of these cycles, and it's not because you did anything wrong. It's not because somebody's trying to punish you. It's because that's just part of life.
Yeah, it's
And that
learning. We're learning.
that's right. And that's the humility, is to, in some ways, okay, this is happening to me. Like after the hurricane, the abuse that, if you've ever been through a natural disaster, you
Mhm.
get lied to, you get conned, you have the banks, the insurance company. I mean, it's just all a big game to them. And when I would start to get upset, I would remember, this isn't happening to you. This is happening to a million people right now.
Right.
And so that humility, that looking at the big picture, is that we're all a part of our human journey is to experience the ocean of suffering. And if we look at many different religions, but I practice as a Buddhist, that the Buddha said that the first noble truth is that to be human means that there will be some suffering along the way, and that humility gives us the grace to kind of stay open and connected to other people while we're going through something like this pandemic,
Right.
which also carries with it kind of the mental health piece, the social isolation piece. I mean, it's a huge amount of hardship for people to deal with all over the world. But in
Mhm.
this country, we're not used to long periods of hardship. We want everything to be over right away, and this is what it's called a disaster of uncertainty, because we don't have a clear timeline. We're getting there, thank God, but we don't have one yet. And
Yeah.
so being humble allows us to accept with grace that we're in a period of hardship, we're in a period of turbulence, and there's uncertainty, but we'll get through it because we've gotten through other cycles before,
Right.
and our ancestors have gotten through other cycles before,
Right.
and surviving hardship is part of our DNA as humans. So we'll and that's that humility of feeling our humanity as we go through these things,
Right.
that everyone is in this universally right now.
Yeah.
And so
We're
that the human,
collectively in it. We're all in
right,
it together. Yeah.
right,
And I've said on the show that I think it happened for a reason, to make us sit still, to make us go within. And so we'll talk about that more. Hey, you guys, got to go to commercial break. I'm here today with Laurie Nadel. She's a PhD. Her book is called The Five Gifts. If you're watching me on YouTube, I'm holding it up. You can pick it up on Amazon. Hey, what's your website, Laurie?
my website is laurienadel.com.
Okay, you
Thank
guys,
you.
you can find her there. And this is Nancy Yearout. This is High Road to Humanity, and we will be right back. Hey, it's Nancy Yearout. I'm here today with Laurie Nadel. We're talking about some deep stuff here, but it's good stuff. And I'm really glad that you wrote this and that you're talking about these things. I really believe in humility, and we've lost so much in our country. When I grew up, we had integrity and we had honesty, and our name meant something, and all these things have gotten lost. And gosh, I'd really like to see it come back, and humility is, and to be humble. You don't see it anymore. People aren't humble. They're so full of themselves and they're so full of ego. So it's so nice that you bring these things up, because it's important. The next thing you talk about is patience. You say
Mhm.
the element of fire. It takes time. This is what God's teaching me right now, that we talk about patience, Lori.
Well, I have to say, I'm the most impatient person in the world. So when I started to write this chapter, I ran into like a writing block that I've never had in my career. And it took me like 2 weeks before I could even sit down and face writing this chapter. It was excruciating because I had to face my own impatience. Maybe I can skip this chapter. But the, but the second gift is really what allows us to accept that sometimes these losses and these unexpected hits can come back in ways we don't expect. A year later, 2 years later, we might find that we're still experiencing some sorrow. We may find that we're still experiencing moments of anger. These are what we call delayed grief reactions, or
Okay.
sometimes we call them STUG, excuse me, which means a sudden temporary upsurge of grief, where you kind of feel that you're reliving it or with something traumatic. You can have a flashback. You can be standing, in a supermarket line, and suddenly your body can feel as though it's re-experiencing a moment of loss or a moment of tragedy. And patience is the gift that just allows us to accept that we're human, and that healing is not a straight line. We don't have a timetable. Everyone heals in her or his own way.
Mhm. Yeah, patience is a tough one for me too, and I think that comes from our society. I mean, we've always, I've always like, oh, hurry up, get it done, and get it done. And when you're in that, it's really hard to have patience, but patience, like they say, is a virtue. My mom used to say that patience is a virtue. And I think as you get older, it gets a little bit easier. I don't know. What do you think? Maybe a little bit.
I think that life teaches you that we don't control everything, and that once we have the humility to accept that we're not in control of everything that happens to us, and sometimes things take time, then we allow ourselves to receive the gift of patience. But I always say, when I give talks, I ask people, would you rather have the gift of patience or a million followers on Twitter? And only one person has ever said, I'd rather have patience.
No, I'd rather have patience, because you know what? And it's interesting, because God knows what's better for us and we don't. And you can call it higher power or whatever. I call him God. And the thing is, a lot of times it's for our own good and we don't even realize it.
That's right. That's right.
And so it's interesting how all this works, how this master plan is all set up. So yeah, that's something though people could do and could use. And with this COVID, we're being made to be patient. I will say
That's
that.
right.
Because
Yeah,
people want to cheat. People want to go out and go to the bar, and people want to go to the restaurants, and they want to do all this stuff. It's almost like cheating, it's like, oh, I can do it. It doesn't matter. I can do it anyway. And it's really interesting because to watch the dynamics of this, because a lot of people, you've got one, side of the spectrum that's afraid to go anywhere, and the other side that says, hey, it's okay. I can go wherever I want, but there is a happy medium there, I think, in this whole maybe balance with
mhm,
this whole thing. Go do what you have to do, but do it, in a proper fashion, I think.
right.
Anyway, so
Well, we
having
all
said
have
that,
to find our own way of navigating this.
yeah.
And, we all have to find our own balance between the isolation and being careful because isolation is a stress amplifier.
Mm,
So people who have chronic illnesses, for example, experience social isolation over the long term
yeah.
because you're not in the normal social flow of your life. But now this is kind of these kind of universal lockdowns and quarantines are creating, I think, a whole subpopulation of people who are literally afraid to leave their house and for whom isolation is becoming a very serious way of life. And that leads to social anxiety, social phobias. I'm hearing from parents that their kids are becoming addicted to video games. They're not talking to their parents anymore. They just want to shut themselves in and live through, whatever their online gaming activities are. So, not to mention, other issues that come up when you're confined to quarters. So
Mhm.
there's a lot for us to be looking at as individuals and as a culture and as a society. But patience, I think, is really the key to unwinding the places where we get stuck and trying to kind of find a better sense of flow as we kind of navigate the twists and turns of this COVID pandemic.
Well said. Yeah. Hey, the next gift you talk about is empathy. And I wrote down this quote from the Dalai Lama that you have in your book. It says, the more we care for the happiness of others, the greater is our sense of well-being. And that's so profound because we've forgotten about everybody else. We're me, me, me. It's become a me, me society, huh?
For a long time,
Hmm.
definitely for a long time, and that I think that's why usually at the beginning of any disaster, you have what first responders call the mission cycle or the help cycle or the empathy cycle, and you see all of the merchandising on television is all about empathy, hashtag empathy. We support empathy. We support first responders. We support healthcare workers. And then by 6 weeks, they've moved on to another story. The cameras have moved on, the
Hmm.
advertisers have moved on, and empathy becomes kind of a forgotten term. When we're recovering from any kind of traumatic event, we need empathy for the long haul.
Hmm.
Because, and I know this isn't going to sound like good news, but the reality is it takes a few years to fully recover from a traumatic event. And by traumatic, I mean something that involved loss of life or threatened loss of life. When we say, "Oh, I had such a traumatic, argument with somebody," that's really not what trauma is.
Okay.
Trauma means that something life-threatening has occurred, and it can be loss of your job because then that affects your ability to survive and take care of yourself and your family. And so, I said trauma is not a bad hair day, but if we're going to get through it collectively, then we need empathy for the long haul. We need to understand that some people will get over it relatively quickly. Some people will have delayed reactions, and after the first anniversary, they may find themselves grieving for what they lost. And I can give you an example.
Yeah.
Um, when lockdown came, I had an office in Greenwich Village for 30 years. It was a
Oh, wow.
part-time office.
Yeah.
And when lockdown came, it was like an iron gate just came like right down, slammed down, and kind of truncated what my professional identity was, my office identity, the presence that I had in that particular neighborhood for 30 years, my professional lifestyle, and it was a shock. And it wasn't until a few months later that I realized that I was grieving for the not just the loss of the physical office, but the loss of that presence, the loss of the connecting with people in person, and that I actually was going through a mourning process because that way of life is pretty much over. I mean, I will never go back to it,
Right.
but I didn't plan it, and I wasn't anticipating it, and I wasn't ready for it. And so that, that's something where we have to realize that we also need empathy for ourselves for
Mhm.
the long haul. And that, maybe a year or two from now, I might find myself suddenly feeling like a surge of grief for the loss of the office. But it actually hit me more now as we're approaching the first anniversary, the realization that that chapter, that 30-year chapter of my professional life is over. The grieving is more likely to hit me now because I was in shock for year one.
Ah,
So very often people think the first anniversary is going to be a big release. And for many people it is. And
mhm.
it's an important marker. But for many, many people, and in this case, we're talking about millions of people, the beginning of the second year after a disaster begins the onset of a grieving process.
Mhm.
And that's something to kind of keep in mind. And so we need to have empathy for ourselves and others because it takes a while, it takes a few years to fully come out of into a full recovery from dealing with these losses.
Interesting. Yeah, and I wouldn't have thought of that. I wouldn't have thought that. I would thought time, they always say time heals, and I guess it does to a certain degree, but you know,
It's not a straight line. I mean, there's a thing
yeah.
that people have long COVID, people I'm working with, sometimes you heal and, you take 2 steps forward and you take 3 steps backward, or, you go for a walk or you walk for a mile and you haven't been able to walk for a long time. And then you have a relapse. So, it's a squiggly line.
Yeah.
And looking at images on the news can also cause a secondary form of
I know,
PTSD.
don't watch the news.
Yeah.
And that's a funny
I
thing. Yeah, because and I have to say I watch the news and I want to throw this out to you real quick before we go to our next commercial break, but it's hard because you have to watch the news and I always tell people you need to be informed. You need to know what's going on, but you don't have to be glued to it and you don't have to, and you take everything with a grain of salt, that type of thing. So what's your feeling on that real quick before we
I always tell people take a news break. If
Yeah.
you're getting triggered, if it's upsetting, turn it off. Turn off the television, turn
Yeah.
off the computer, turn off your phone. Take
Mm-hmm.
a news break at least 24 hours, no news, do something fun for yourself, do
Yes.
something relaxing, talk to a friend, hang out with your pet, but really take frequent breaks from the news because it is overwhelming
It
and
is.
it can cause a vicarious trauma reaction because it's deeply upsetting to see many of the things that we see and hear and feel when we're exposed to those images.
Right. Hey guys, we're going to commercial break. I'm here today with Laurie Nadel. She's a PhD. Her book is The Five Gifts. When we come back, we're going to talk about the fourth and the fifth gift. All right, you guys, this is Nancy Yearout. This is High Road to Humanity. We'll be right back. Hi, it's Nancy Yearout. This is High Road to Humanity. I'm here with Laurie Nadel. We're going to talk about the fourth and fifth gifts in her book. You guys got to pick this up. It's really good. She's got great stories in here. I just kind of read a lot of these stories, that you put in here about different people. And I just thought it was really cool. And thanks for sharing all this stuff with us. There was something in here that really hit home to me. Here we are. You put in here, I love this, Lori. You don't even know I'm going to read this, but I am. You put in the prosperity prayer.
Mm.
And I hadn't seen this in a long time. And I'm just going to read it real quick because unless do you have your book handy?
No, no,
Okay,
sorry.
then I'm going to read it real quick because you guys, everybody's going through a lot right now with the COVID and everything. And, me too. I mean, I'm going into different directions and this really hit home. So I want to share it with the audience. And here we go. She put it on her book, in her book. It's on page 122, The Prosperity Prayer. And this is from Lynn Robinson. It's her prayer that she's put together, I guess, in 2001. So it says, Dear God or Spirit or Universe, I surrender my financial affairs and concerns about money to your divine care and love. I ask that you remove my worries, anxieties, and fears about money and replace them with faith. I know and trust that my debts will be paid and money will flow into my life. I have only to look to nature to see proof of the abundance you provide. I release all negative thoughts about money and know that prosperity is my true state. I commit to being grateful for all that I now have in my life. I learn to manage my finances wisely, seeking help where needed. And finally, I ask you to help me understand my purpose in life, to act on that purpose with courage and strength. I know that prosperity will come in part by doing the work I love. Please help me use my skills and knowledge to be of service in the world. Thank you, God. Amen. What a profound prayer. And thank you for that. Thank you.
Oh, I'm going to thank Lynn for that. I've written a chapter in a book called Financial Trauma and Institutional Betrayal. And what happens to many people during a disaster is that they learn that the institutions that are supposed to provide for them or provide for us
Mhm.
are withholding money, or they're making you jump through so many hoops, or they give you money and then they take it away for various reasons. For example, if you've had a tornado or hurricane or a fire and you get an insurance settlement, the bank that holds your mortgage will seize your check because they're listed as the insurance company makes out the check to whoever owns your mortgage and you. And the bank will put it in a reserve fund, and they will only dole it out to you in installments if you meet their criteria. And they will harass you by demanding that you keep sending in the same paperwork over and over and over. Now, I thought this was just happening to me, but then I read in the newspaper that this was happening to everybody.
Wow.
So there's a certain it's almost like there's an intention to harass people to the point that a certain percentage of people will just give up. They'll walk
Well,
away
they
from
don't
the
want to
property.
pay. They don't want to pay. Let's just say it like it is. I mean, all these
That's
big
right.
insurance companies, they just don't want to pay when it comes, they'll take your money and they're happy to take
Right.
it. But when it
That's
comes
right.
down to it, they don't want to dole it out. And that is
Right.
wrong. And I believe all that stuff comes around. What do you think, Lori?
Right. Well, I think it does eventually, but the sense of betrayal that you experience when you're going through that, and the financial trauma that you go through when you can't get the money you need to live on, or to rebuild your house, or to help you with your food expenses,
Sure.
that sense of betrayal adds a layer of trauma to whatever the initial loss is, and it never gets talked about. But now we have an economic disaster, as I was saying, COVID. You have the physical illness itself, you have the mental health issues around the illness, you have the anxiety and depression, and you have the substance abuse issues that come from that, the feelings of helplessness. You have PTSD that comes from it, medical trauma that comes from that. And then you have the economic catastrophe. So, as I said, it's kind of a triple strand pandemic. So, you're already in a fragile emotional state, and you're supposed to get your check, or you're supposed to get your food coupon from the government, and then you find that they're making you jump through all these hoops, and there's all this, and they'll harass you. If you hand in your form with black ink instead of blue ink, some bureaucrat can reject your forms completely and
Crazy.
tell
That's
you to go back
craziness.
to
Yeah.
right. So it's like harassment by paperwork is
Yeah.
something that happens very often after a tragic event, a national disaster or a regional disaster. And it's important that we recognize that this is not you being dramatic. This is a very real and severe emotional hit. And we need to be able to find ways of helping ourselves to cope. So
Mhm.
for me, the prosperity prayer was really a miracle. I
Yeah.
mean, it was magic because it took away my fear and anxiety about money, and it gave me a sense of hope that somewhere, as you said, what goes around comes around. Somewhere down the road there will be justice, and eventually, fortunately, in my case, there was justice. But I know many people who just they just had to give up and let the bank keep the money and keep the house because they couldn't stand fighting all the time.
Right. Well, when you say this prayer, I mean, it reminds you that, the animals do just fine.
Right.
And it reminds us to have faith. And faith is
That's
hard
right.
to fight. Faith is a difficult thing. Faith took me a long, long time. And it's hard to have faith in what you can't see. But once you do, and you say this prayer and you really believe it in your heart and soul, and that's part of it. And I think that's probably what you did. When you believe it and there's a higher power, it helps. It makes you feel a little bit better. It's comforting.
It does. It gave me a lot of hope, and it also allowed me literally to turn my anxiety over, to my angels and just say, look, I this is really scary. I can't deal with it.
Yeah.
Please help me.
You guys take it. Yeah.
Right. Please take
Okay.
it
Hey,
because
let's get the last two gifts in before we got
right.
to get out of here for today. The fourth gift is forgiveness, which I wrote down from your book. When recovering emotionally from a violent event, forgiveness is the elephant in the room.
That's right. Forgiveness is it's one of those words that people have a visceral reaction to, but I like to think of forgiveness more as forgiving, so that when we step into what it's like to be in a forgiving state, we can be forgiving of our enemy, what the perpetrator. We can be forgiving 5% today and 20% tomorrow and 80% down the road. We may never get to 100%. But when we're actively feeling that we are in a forgiving state, it also lessens the pain of what we're carrying. There's no question that in any disaster, there are failures of the system to provide for certain people, and it can be random. I mean, there are wealthy people who died of COVID the first few months. There are poor people in minority neighborhoods who are literally fighting for their lives with COVID. Some of them, won't make it to the hospital, or they won't be able to get treatment because the hospitals are overwhelmed. And so, later on, when the dust is settled and you're kind of trying to assess what the physical and emotional damage is, to be in a more forgiving place and understand that sometimes things are just out of our control.
Mhm.
And when we can be more forgiving, we can let that anger that's part of grieving, the kind of, it will pass through us instead of getting bottled up and causing other issues for us down the road.
Right. So turn the anger into forgiveness.
Right,
And I always say, you've got to forgive because it's not hurting them, it's hurting you. And once
right.
you can come to that realization or that awareness that it's for your benefit and not for the other person or the other party or the company or whatever. Because when you carry that, I mean, it's just like a burden carrying it,
Mhm.
when you don't forgive somebody and you're holding on to it. Hey, the fifth gift is growth. And I wrote down, we gain knowledge and strength from sad and happy events in our lives, and that brings us growth. Talk
Mhm.
about that, Lori.
Well, when we're all growing. I mean, just being alive, our cells are regenerating, every moment. We get like a new liver, I think every what, 90 days, and our organs
I
are
didn't know
constantly
that.
regenerating. Yeah, I think I have some of those clinical statistics
I
in the
must
book.
have missed that.
So we don't really need to do anything in order to experience growth because we're growing all the time. But
Mhm.
there's a certain point of healing where we can look back at the event and we can say, I wish that had never happened. I wish I'd never had to go through that. I'd never wish it on anybody else. But if I hadn't gone through that, I would never have learned what I needed to learn, and I would never be who I am today.
Mhm.
And so that's the gift of growth.
Yeah.
And when we are in the gift of growth, a lot of things kind of fall into perspective. And for many people, we begin to use this experience as a catalyst to be able to find new meaning and purpose, to redefine what's important to us and to live with a sense of wholeness in the greater community of just being human.
Yeah, I agree with you wholeheartedly because things happen and then they've happened to me. And then I look back and think, well, look what I learned from that experience. I'm
Right,
a different person because of it.
right.
And so, yeah, it's hard. I mean, it's hard down here on earth to live this life that we all live. But
Yes.
hey, thanks to you for writing this book and for helping us out. You guys, it's called The Five Gifts. And tell everybody how they can get in touch with you. Give them all your information, Lori.
Well, thank you. You can get in touch with me through my website, which is laurienadel.com. And the book is available on Amazon and Barnes and Noble. And there's a Kindle copy available. I believe there's an ebook copy available. And there is, you just say though there are many used copies available. If I know this is a difficult time for
Yeah.
people, so there are many used copies available at less than the retail cost. So I hope that you'll find it helpful in getting through the difficult times that we have now, and probably for a little while to come.
Yeah, unfortunately. Hey, Laurie, thanks for coming on the show. I really
Thank you for
appreciate it.
having me. I
Yeah,
really appreciate you, and
yeah.
I love talking to you. Thank you so much for having me here.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Hey guys, until next week, this is Nancy Yearout. This is High Road to Humanity, and we'll see you next time. Everybody have a great week and take care. Bye.
Connect the dots and keep the motion. Can achieve your goal. Let's hit the high road.
Hey, you guys, join me next week on The High Road for more stories filled with wisdom, love, and hope for our future. Have a fabulous week and know that by staying on the high road, you will make it to your destination. Visit my website, nancyyearout.com, where you can book a private session to learn how to tap into your own abilities. And check out my YouTube channel. It's Nancy Yearout's High Road to Humanity.
You can achieve your goal.